Howdy, all you delicious people. The OC, Season 1, Episodes 9 through 14. So, recently, after watching this the first time around, kind of reflecting on, man, yeah, I really enjoy this show. I think reasonably within here, if I didn't seem like this before when watching this show. Like, when early on watching this show, there's a lot of heavy hitting things. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of big events that have to just kind of rapture through the entire town, kind of thing. Like now we have it to where it seems like in every episode here, especially when they kind of get up in the morning and they have their morning talks and stuff like that. There is always some really funny jokes to be had while in these morning conversations, which I think is really funny. Man, do we really have it to where all these people are really hitting their strides with these comic relief kind of moments, which I thought to be really hilarious. Especially when Seth ultimately talks about Thanksgiving, I thought that moment was hilarious. So, going on into this, ultimately, if you haven't seen the previous review of me talking about the early episodes, really, I'm not going to backtrack and recap them now. But ultimately, go ahead and check out that first portion of the first 8 episodes of the OC. And so ultimately, I'm just going to kind of get in here and I'm like, I really don't like where every single character is heading into these episodes. I'm ultimately just like, oh my god, here we are. let's get him over through these humps of to ultimately get past this era of time in the season to hopefully get to better times. But again, there are some funny moments, but reasonably, there is also just a lot of just everybody has to be in some kind of turmoil, and we have it to where ultimately every single person's life is ultimately getting affected through these 6 episodes, and it's not like a huge ripple effect like before, when ultimately Jimmy had kind of affected this entire town, where everybody had been talking about it seemingly for days on end. Any kind of real like uh, big gossip thing that happened in this town ultimately is kind of quickly kind of snuffed out, and ultimately just kind of meh, yeah, but that's not as big as some of the stuff that was happening here before and whatever, what have you. So I ultimately was going into this, and recently I'm just kind of yeah, these episodes are kind of fun, but then again, I also just kind of am a little annoyed about the obvious blatant thing that's kind of going on in here with kind of Ryan and Marissa in these episodes also. The whole kind of, you have Ryan that is ultimately just gonna just walk over to Marissa and easily win her over, just to eventually within that same episode, she immediately is ripping away from him because ultimately he didn't tell her something, or maybe even did tell her something, but ultimately she gave him some crap about it. Dude, you told me the truth. Why can't you just let me live in blissful ignorance? And then ultimately, then we get to see Marissa eventually pop some bottles and stuff like that, because ultimately she becomes a recluse, a person who is going to be wreaking havoc, an anarchist of sorts. That ultimately she will not be stopped. She can't be reasoned with, and she absolutely will tell you that it's a good time for her to just seek some therapy, because that's ultimately where her story eventually goes into. Sadly enough, because reasonably we have it to where Misha and or uh, good God, Marissa. There we go. I'm like, what is her name? Who is that gal? So Marissa ultimately is to be just kind of going down into a bottom of the barrel spiral kind of thing. So we ultimately have it to where Seth has probably the most interesting journey going on in here, because ultimately, like I am just a person that is easily won over by Seth compared to everybody else in this story. I don't care. Like I like Ryan, but ultimately I just don't care about him. Except at some point you just kind of have to give up on Ryan. Sadly enough, because ultimately he's just a person that is going to be the form of his own destructor kind of thing. So reasonably, I'm just kind of like, you know what? I'm going to cling on to Seth because I like Seth. Because ultimately everything kind of works out for him in the end. Uh, and also, I just like Sandy just because I like Sandy. I just can't stop enjoying Sandy Cohen. Because reasonably, he's, again, the morality police, and you kind of gotta love Sandy for being that. So if we don't have the dynamic duo of Sandy and Seth in this show, like, man, would this show just not work out that well? If they just had a differently written character, it just wouldn't work out that well. So we have it to where Seth is ultimately juggling two women in these episodes, and we have it to where I think they're kind of stretching the whole like they're kind of stretching like Seth having two women. Because when reasonably looking at it, they're kind of really like stretching the whole fact that it's like that he has to try to like win them both over. He can't just choose one or the other and whatever. And so recently we have it to where like Seth is kind of like stretching out this whole two women thing, and we have it to where I just think it's kind of funny where Ryan is ultimately telling Sandy at some point, it's like, yeah, your son is juggling two women, and Sandy's like, what? My son, Seth, juggling women? Would have never thought that in a million years. My son. Um, but also, we eventually also have Ryan, who is to eventually find a sport that evidently he could probably get kicked off of at some point. Um, but yeah, so really, I think the most things that are kind of going on in these episodes are really just kind of almost Sandy and Kirsten in these episodes. If not, like it's either a fight between that or Seth's double women time, double women whammy time, I guess. And so ultimately, yeah, Ryan is just like a person that is in these episodes and I'm like, God, I'm disinterested with him just because of whoever he's tied with, that ultimately I'm disinterested in their story. Because ultimately I'm like, God, I like ultimately Ryan is tied to Marissa, which I'm like, no, I don't like where she's going in here. And ultimately we have it to Ryan is kind of tied to Julie in these episodes, because ultimately there's a reason for that, which I'll talk about in spoilers. And ultimately, I was just like God, like Ryan is just tied to everybody and everything that I'm just not really like enjoying. I'm ultimately like I liked the early episodes where like Ryan was just kind of like uh, he was OCing his way through through here and just kind of like remembering this show reminds me now of when I reviewed Cobra Kai season 3, because there's a character on there that ultimately kind of goes through the same journey that Ryan ends up going to. So yeah, I think that's all that I really wanted to say about here was just that this is to the point in this journey now where I just kind of want to get through these episodes and get to the point of being at happier times, let's just say, or like ultimately kind of pushing through the kind of murky waters to get us through to where like okay, I liked these stories more when these things happened. So it's just kind of just a mowing over of getting through these to get us through better times. So speaking of time, it's about that time again to ultimately go into spoilers about this show because there are things that ultimately you need to do at some point called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So, reasonably, I now am finally going to talk about my favorite thing in this show. Uh, I love Summer in these episodes. I think Summer is my favorite part about these episodes, and yeah, it's undeniably the best thing about these episodes. Even though like story wise, I would say it's either a toss up between Sandy and Seth. I just like whenever I'm seeing Summer in these episodes, I'm just enjoying Summer whenever I can see her. But it's really just really and truly Seth's story here. But my most favorite thing is ultimately when Summer is coming to the realization because she cannot control herself that she loves Seth. And like that moment when they're on the yacht together and ultimately she's kissing him and she's like, "Oh my god, I love Seth Cohen and I can't help it." Like that moment there is just the like her being horrified by the fact that she can't help herself, I think is the best moment of this show, bar none. The entire show, that there is the best moment. But also the whole thing with Seth ultimately talking about Thanksgiving, and we'll get to that. So we ultimately have it here. Like there's every episode we have to kind of get these people to transition to these interesting scenes and so on and so forth and blah 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 blah. So recently I'm gonna just start jumping all over the place, so I apologize in fact, but like really when looking at this I'm gonna have to jump all over the place. So recently we have it to where the journey of Kirsten and Sandy are reasonably going to come to some kind of consistent kind of like poking of the bear between these two characters. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Sandy and Kirsten are really trying to find their alone time in these episodes. And reasonably we have it to where reasonably Sandy wants to, of course, be with Kirsten and Kirsten the same. They want to find their bedroom time, let's just say. And we have to reasonably that they're struggling to find it because we have Sandy and Kirsten that are like working long hours. So we end up having it to where we have Sandy who is getting thrown a case that he absolutely needs to take. We have it to ultimately, where is she? Uh, Not Haley. Uh, oh my god, where is? I will just say Rachel. There we go. I'm like, she's in here somewhere. Rachel. So Rachel is ultimately giving Sandy a case that ultimately he's going to want to take, because ultimately we have Sandy, who is going to have to go up against Caleb Nickel about a portion of land. Caleb Nickel ultimately wants to plop out like a whole golf course and housing and stuff like that to make money off of it. And we ultimately find out that reasonably Sandy is going to try to fight this case to ultimately keep this land and be a tree hugger and whatever. So we eventually have it to where Kirsten is ultimately finding out that Sandy is interested in taking this case. And Kirsten's like, oh my God, how could you take this case? And Sandy's like, well, I didn't think I wanted to be 100% attached to it. And so Kirsten's like, oh my God, you're going against my father. How could you? You're going up against my business. And so reasonably that's where we kind of see kind of the pitter patter of reasonably Sandy is coming home late, and Kirsten is ultimately accusing Sandy's like, well, you know that woman is really attractive, and like, are you really just like, you're really just making your work your life, and ultimately you just don't want to come home to me, and kind of like, but ultimately Sandy's like, no, like, I'm just busy at work. Like, we're buried trying to figure out how to beat your dad. How to beat your daddy. We're trying to figure out how to slay the dragon, which is your father, to ultimately try and get this deal. So we have it to where we find out that reasonably that eventually Jimmy is going to talk to Sandy and eventually mention that, like, hey man, I kissed your woman, suck it. And we ultimately have it to where Sandy is almost going to want to punch Jimmy, but then ultimately he like has to confront his wife about all this. Like, how did you not tell me? Like, dude, out of the numerous times that ultimately you were thinking that I was cheating on you with Rachel, how could you? Like, dude, you were the one locking lips with Jimmy. Like, I wasn't doing anything with Rachel. Yeah, I was probably tempted, but I didn't go into further of that temptation. So, because we have it at some points where Rachel was laying it on pretty dang thick. She was ultimately just like, like, I'm just gonna, like, stretch my body and do a little twister with these books and stuff with Sandy and have a good old joke. And it seems like Rachel is almost going to be teasing about like, well, hey, like, what if it were to ever happen to where ultimately we would just be kind of intertwined together, kind of thing. So we have to where Sandy is kind of like really living on the edge of temptation with this girl, but ultimately he's keeping everything completely 100% professional, but they're keeping up long hours, ridiculously long hours. And so eventually when Caleb Nickel is ultimately to hear the kind of quite possibly settling this whole deal, Caleb ultimately laughs at the deal that they were going to make him, and Reason like, dude, you stayed up till like 2 in the morning, Sandy, you and with Rachel. Ultimately, yeah, like, Kirsten has been telling me that you guys have been staying up all hours. Like, what have you really been doing? What have you really been doing? Uh, and so we ultimately have it to where like Sandy is just kind of like upset because it's like, dude, you don't respect my work. You don't respect my like what I do. And so ultimately we also have Sandy who's looking at Kirsten like, yeah, you threw me under the bus. How dare you? I can't wait for Jimmy to tell me that you and him smooched. I can't wait. So we also now have what's going on from the tail end of Mexico, or Mexico, and we ultimately have it to where Marissa is ultimately kind of going into realizing that Luke had cheated on her. And no, and so now she's just kind of hiding from Luke. Luke is coming to try and see her. He's ultimately trying to come into Jimmy's home, and Jimmy's like, no. Like, if anything, Marissa told me what happened. You're not seeing her. You're not looking at her. You're not going to ultimately hear exactly if she's going to hear everything that you said to me right now or not, because ultimately she had heard everything that you were going to tell me, because ultimately she's right over there. I'll point her out to you, but you won't be able to talk to her, kind of thing. So we ultimately have it to her. Marissa's like, oh, thanks, Dad. And it's like, yeah, I'm your dad. I'm going to try to do something nice. So ultimately, it seems that we have it to where Marissa is seemingly slowly but surely slipping a little bit. It seems that even Jimmy has to go and ask her. It's like, well, hey, you could have seen therapy. You could have seen some therapy. Like, if anything, like the whole problem with you going to like Tijuana and getting a little druggied. Recently, he's like, hey, man, you could have saw therapy. And Marissa's like, no, I kind of want to just work things out, which ultimately makes her work things out with a bottle of booze. And so we recently have it to where Ryan is ultimately trying to, like, he's hating on Luke, so ultimately he feels that ultimately he has to hate on him by joining the soccer team, with Luke being a member of the soccer team. And we have it to where Ryan ultimately is doing some illegal tackle to where the coach is like, illegal! Throw a flag on the play! I know that that's American football, but whatever. And we ultimately have it to where Ryan is to be having a meeting with his coach, and so Sandy ends up finding out that it's like, oh, Ryan's going to be suspended for 2 games. And so Sandy has to kind of put the hammer down on Ryan, just like, you know what? Like, you're going to hate every single, like, rich, la-di-da, $1 million kid that ultimately goes into this school because you're not that person. Or technically, like, you are that person, but we adopted you, so we're not going to give you $1 million right out of the gate, but we'll kind of give you enough to, like, keep on keeping on, if you know what I mean. So we ultimately have it to where Sandy's ultimately just like, you are one sneeze away. You are one tip over and you're way out of our lives. Like, I don't want anybody to pull you away from us because you're our family. And that should have been the moment where Ryan should have said to Sandy, it's like, I love you, Dad. And that would have been amazing. But no, none of that happens. Because ultimately, like, Sandy is telling him, it's like, you're a part of our family now, and, like, we want to keep you. We want to keep it that way. And I thought that that moment was really just, like, it was a tender moment. It was a nice, sweet little moment. So, it ultimately have it to where, at some point, we have Ryan, who is seemingly getting really intimate with Marissa, to the point where ultimately, like, Ryan and Marissa are even getting to the point of passionate love-ins. And we ultimately have to where Kirsten ultimately walks in on Ryan and Marissa ultimately in passions of sorts. And she's like, oh, Ryan, I'm just gonna make myself come on in and just start talking to you just to ruin your passionate love that you have between Marissa and just like come on and keep talking to you instead of just going like, oh, okay, this isn't something that I should have seen. I'm out of here. No, like Kirsten just like, hey Ryan, want a sandwich kind of thing? Because and Marissa is just kind of like walking out of the pool house, and we have to where Kirsten's like, well, sorry, this never really ever happens to Seth, but it probably will now. So it ultimately have it to where Seth is juggling two girls. This is the most interesting part of this journey, and again, I always love Seth's stories. So, if anything, the Thanksgiving thing, I thought that joke was hilarious. So, you ultimately have it to where Seth ultimately loves Thanksgiving. Like, he has this fantasy dream that he is going to eat so much food on Thanksgiving that he is going to pass out from it. And, like, that is his dream, that he dreams all the time about eating so much food that he ends up passing out and smacking himself onto a table or something because he just ate too much food. And so we ultimately have it to where Seth has to decide between Anna and Summer. And reasonably, I would just go with ultimately just flip a coin at that point because either one of them, like, reasonably Anna is a dynamite gal and Summer is just a also equally dynamite like gal. So it's really just like Seth is like ultimately just why not just wind up with Summer because that's what ultimately probably might happen at some point. So it's inevitable because ultimately he named his boat after her. So we have it to a reasonably like we have it to where Anna is consistently trying to make Summer jealous to where Summer is looking at Seth as like, hey, Seth, how about you help me with my schoolwork? How about you help me with my paperwork? And Anna steps in and she's like, oh no. Like, you're not going to use him. No. Like, if anything, you're just going to have to sponge off with somebody else. F you. Like, no. So we have it to a reasonably Summer ends up going in and is ending up like trying to grab onto guys to just be like, oh, well, this is going to be the guy that I'm going to date. And she's ultimately going to hate whoever it is because she's just grabbing on to the next good looking guy that she finds. And then ultimately, once she finds these guys to be uninteresting, she's like, God. So we have it to where Anna is ultimately dissecting frogs with Seth. And we have it to where like Seth is consistently asking like, "Oh my God, Anna, this is working. The plan is going into effect." And then Anna is just ultimately feeling used. She's ultimately just like, God, like if anything, like I was hoping to just kind of like do this thing consistently to where ultimately Seth got enough confidence, but then also like I would get something out of the deal. I would get something out of the bargain. I would get to like have Seth just be so won over by me helping him out that ultimately he would just be giving me some smoochins. But no. Seth is just kind of like when they go to the carnival and ultimately Marissa is to try to be won over by Ryan on this tilt-a-whirl or whatever the heck that one contraption is. Ultimately, they get stuck in the air, and we have it to where Ryan is ultimately having a fear of heights, and Marissa is ultimately trying to distract Ryan by kissing him, which is interesting enough. We have it to where eventually Seth is ultimately to be locking lips with Anna, and again, Seth is ultimately looking, and here's the goofiest thing that made absolutely donut holes worth of sense to me. So, we have it to where Anna wants to win Seth over and is ultimately talking about Ryan, how that that's all she wants to do is just win Seth over. And we have it to where Ryan is just like, well, establish dominance, kind of really go in there and just put your foot down. So we ultimately have Anna kissing Seth to ultimately put her foot down and say yeah, I want you, so come hither, kind of thing. And we have it to where Seth is ultimately, his reply is just oh, well, I'm making Summer jealous. And I'm like, oh my god. So we have it to where Summer sees Seth kissing Anna, and so reasonably, we have it to where Summer eventually is getting all jelly because that's who she is. And so ultimately we have it to where Summer and Seth are on this yacht, and she is kissing him, and she's like, oh my god, I didn't think I'd be kissing Seth Cohen of all people. But I think it's also hilarious how when Anna is kissing on Seth, we have it to where Summer's like, oh my god, can you believe that she is locking lips with Seth Cohen? Ultimately, she's just doing it because he has money, and so on and so forth. How could she? And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, Summer was just after money grabbing from people before. If we remember the episode where Summer was ultimately using Seth to meet all these other guys that all had all these money bags, and we have it to where Seth is just going dude, the only bags that they're looking at are the bags that are on your chest, and if you know what I mean, they were looking at your chest, and I was actually really enjoying you. I was actually really liking to be with you, and yeah, so Summer is just as money grubbing as freaking anybody, and she is worse. So F her for saying any crap about anybody being a money grubber, because she was more of a money grubber than anybody else in this show. So we have it to where Summer is ultimately going and seeing Seth get some kissing by Anna, and then eventually we have it to where Seth just walks over to Summer and ultimately eats a piece of her cotton candy and goes on some ride together. I'm like, wait a minute, this is the most we have it to where Seth kisses Anna and then walks over to Summer to go on a ride together, which makes no actual sense. I would have thought that the scene should have ended with basically Seth and Anna just running off to the sunset together, and Anna just chasing after Seth, but no, that doesn't happen at all. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably in here that we have to find that Julie is ending up with Caleb Nickel. And so reasonably on this journey of yachts and parties and stuff like that, so we have it to where ultimately Ryan is noticing that Julie is with Caleb, and so eventually he has to tell Marissa the truth about all this, because Marissa is thinking that her family is going to get back together and everything is going to be copacetically be perfectly fine, and it's not going to be. We have it to where reasonably Marissa is so admittedly thinking oh my god, my family's going to get back together, everything's going to be perfectly fine. Oh, Marissa's oh, we're going to go back to having me and Ryan be neighbors and everything's going to work out. And Ryan has to convince her, no, it won't. It never will. Marissa, Julie is with Caleb, Could you believe that? She is just kind of like dusting off those old rusty bones. No offense to the actor that plays Caleb. He's a handsome man. I've seen him in some stuff besides the OC. And I actually like him in anything else besides the OC. But I even like him in the OC. I like him as the guy that everybody has to hate. But ultimately, there is some kind of tender moments between uh, Caleb and Kristen. I think that those moments are just kind of nice. Where ultimately we have it to where Caleb is mentioning to Kirsten how underhanded she was and how he loves how underhanded she was. And anyway, so we have it to where eventually there is a raffle going on to have a kind of getaway thing. And funny enough, we have it to where Sandy and Kirsten wins this raffle, but after that, we have it to where, or before that, we have it to where Marissa goes and outs Julie and Caleb for having their relationship, and now they kept it a secret. So we also have the journey of Luke in these episodes, where Luke ultimately has to have his father being found out upon that ultimately Luke's father is gay, which is ultimately okay. It's like, man, like, yeah, so what? So he's gay. Who cares? So the ultimate to our Luke ultimately is to go through this journey of doing some paper with Ryan forcibly, because these guys have to just work things out. Because ultimately we have it to where Luke lets Ryan walk over to kiss Marissa in a tilt-a-whirl Esh-like thing, whatever it's called. And so reasonably we have it to where Luke and Ryan are just kind of like quasi like there's this kind of like unspoken kind of bizarrish, like it's kind of weird between Luke and Ryan through these journeys, because ultimately we have them eventually to where Luke ultimately becomes like their like friend, and he just kind of becomes that really awkward guy that everybody has to just kind of like deal with. But and that's no fault to the actor that ends up playing this. It's just kind of like that's who he just becomes. So he just become like, I think Luke sadly just kind of becomes a third wheel to everything in this show eventually at some point. So metaphorically speaking, not literally speaking, that he like is like a love triangle or whatever of anything consistently. But anyway, mood point. So we ultimately have it to where Luke is going with Ryan doing this paper, and we find out at this auto dealership that ultimately Luke's father is ultimately is going away, like going out with another man, and so ultimately Luke finds this out, and we eventually have it to where Luke's father comes out to his wife, and his wife eventually, like, everybody finds out in town. We ultimately have Luke, who wanted Ryan to keep his silence about all this, but eventually this secret gets out anyways, and Luke blames Ryan, and like Ryan only told Marissa, and Marissa didn't tell anybody. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably the word gets out on Luke's father being gay. Everybody hears about it, and so reasonably Luke's father is just kind of like hailed as the pariah of this place, because it's like, oh my god, he had an affair. So we have it to where ultimately Luke is just kind of spinning out, because it's like, man, like, what happened to my life? What happened to everything? I thought everything was working out, and eventually we get to where like Ryan is kind of like the shoulder to cry on for Luke, because reasonably Luke is like, well, it was me, but when Ryan is really looking at Luke is like, dude, at least you had a dad. Like, dude, you know how many like freaking stepdads that I have that were garbage? Because ultimately, my biological father was never there for me. At least you had a biological father that was there for you. He went to some of your games or most of your games. Like, my dad didn't even know I existed until probably what is it, season 4, season 3. Ultimately, he'll probably maybe at some point do a thing at some point. Ryan's biological father. So going on into here, we have to where Ryan gets Ryan and Luke are approached by some other team to where ultimately he has to beat them up, but then the rest of the team ends up showing up and then they get all beat up. So pushing on, so we have Sandy who comes in. Excuse me. We ultimately have Sandy who comes in and has to kind of deal with this whole scenario of Luke and Luke's father. And Luke's father ultimately like telling her like, "Man, I've destroyed my life," and Sandy's telling him it's like, you know what? It took a lot of courage for you to finally like come out of the closet and tell everybody that you are who you are and whatever. It's like it took a lot of courage, especially with a town like this that could gossip to the heavens about you. Yeah, it took a lot of courage. So we ultimately have it to where Kirsten is kind of won over by Sandy by kind of the little speech they ended up doing. And then eventually Luke ends up kind of being won over by his father and ultimately kind of just goes home with him. So we ultimately have it to where in the season, so we have it to where reasonably we're getting to the point of the holidays in these episodes. We ultimately have Thanksgiving, of course, where Kirsten is trying to make food and everybody's desperately trying to not have her make one lick of food. And reasonably, it goes into that Kirsten ends up burning the turkey, so they end up just deciding to just order out anyways, which I thought was hilarious. But yeah, so we have it to a reasonably Anna is coming in to try to make her own little thing of food that ultimately she would make. So we end up having to where Trey ultimately calls Ryan just so that way they can meet together because ultimately he misses him during the holidays. But really, Ryan is just suckered in to talking to Trey to ultimately have him steal a car to recently do some last job for him. So we have it to ultimately Ryan has to go down to Chino to ultimately do this job, and that ultimately gets us to meeting a girl that ultimately he had been tying to for seemingly most of his life. But then recently, after leaving Chino, we have it to where seemingly uh, Teresa. Teresa, yeah, I think that, yeah, Teresa. We have it to where Teresa is ultimately seemingly the love of Ryan's life, but ultimately Ryan had left. He just stopped. He just left one day. And so when Ryan shows up at Teresa's doorstep, recently Teresa's like, "Where have you been for months? Like, where have you been?" And ultimately Ryan's like, "Well, it's a long story." Basically, we have it to where every single time there's a new person that comes in here, like Haley, we ultimately have Ryan who has to be asked by Haley, "Who are you?" And he's like, "It's a long story." Like, here's the first 8 episodes, or first whatever episodes of season 1. Give you a recap of figuring out who I am. So you ultimately have a tour. We find out that evidently Ryan ultimately loved to do plays, which is, I guess, a joking thing that they could use against him at some point to just kind of make fun of him. So, pushing on. So, we ultimately have it to where Ryan is stealing a car and he's consistently telling Marissa, "Hey, like, I'm going to give you bus fare so ultimately you can get back home because reasonably you don't want any part of this. You don't want any part of this deal, and Marissa's like, no, I'm gonna do this because I'm your boyfriend. I'm gonna you're my boyfriend, and so I'm gonna do this. I don't care if we end up in prison or whatever. So Ryan ends up doing this deal, and it works out. So excuse me. So eventually we have. I'm gonna pause here for a second. So ultimately, we have it to where Ryan is doing this trick and it's working out. So ultimately, we have it to where Seth, excuse me, ultimately, we have it to where Seth is dancing between two women, metaphorically speaking. We have it to where Seth is ultimately having Anna coming in to see him in Thanksgiving. So ultimately, we have Seth who is taking Anna into the pool house and kind of making out with her. And we eventually have it to where Summer comes in, and so Seth ends up taking Summer to his or no wait, like I think Anna goes to no wait, Anna goes to uh Seth's room and Summer goes to the pool house. And Seth is consistently repetitiously going from Anna to Summer, Anna to Summer, Anna to Summer, to eventually to where reasonably Anna and Summer both go into the house. And we have it to where reasonably, like, I thought the funny moment was when Summer was going in, it's like, oh, are you coming in for seconds? And ultimately we have it to where Sandy turns around and he's like, oh my god, she just got a godsmacked. I thought it was hilarious. So we have it to a reasonably. Seth ultimately has never had one woman, let alone now two, and so reasonably he's just kind of like using these women, both of them, and because he like has like a gold mine on his hands, so he just can't really get rid of either one or the other. And so reasonably he's just like, oh my god, like I'm just so happy for this moment. But we have for ultimately like that Anna is just gonna consistently just she's always gonna be second. It's sadly enough. So we have it to where eventually Anna and Summer are ultimately demanding for Seth to choose between the two of them, and we have it to where ultimately that Seth just demands that both of them end up being just friends. To where eventually, when they get to the Christmas episode, that we have it to where ultimately Seth is to give both Anna and Summer the exact same present. That Seth ultimately calls it the Seth Starter Pack, and so reasonably we have it to where eventually Seth gives these two girls the same present and they both give him back the exact same present, say I don't want to just be friends, so here's your present. I don't want anything from Christmas from you. See you later, bye. You ultimately have it to where Seth is really just in awe of just like God, there's no way I can win this because ultimately I want both of them. And basically, the presents that they end up giving Seth at some point, we ultimately have it to where reasonably uh, we have Anna who ends up giving Seth a comic book that she had put together, which ultimately he thoroughly enjoyed. But we have it to where eventually Summer's present is ultimately to dress like Wonder Woman and lasso Seth, which I thought was a really funny image. And we ultimately have it to where Anna ultimately walks in on Summer, ultimately being in full Wonder Woman garb, and she's like, "Oh my God, you look amazing!" And ultimately, like the whole present that she had gave him. She's like, oh my god, what am I, 8? Like, I guess this wasn't gonna win him over, but like it's a thought that counts, with the exclusion of just I guess Summer's thought was just like, well, I guess I just have to just just win him over by ultimately just really just intimately winning him over, but it is what it is. So we ultimately have it to a reasonably. Uh, we have here to where we seemingly have it to where we have to kind of notch out every holiday, and we have it to where it's now New Year's, and it seems that interesting enough, we have Summer and Anna that are kind of being a couple themselves. They're kind of doing everything together. They're almost wearing the exact same kind of color schemes together, which I thought was interesting because eventually that's what happens with Anna and Seth at some point. They're just kind of wearing the exact same clothes, identical at some point. So I thought it was kind of interesting when they got to the movie picks for ultimately. Sandy was had picked Over the Top, the Sylvester Stallone movie, the arm wrestling movie, and so reasonably we have it to where so Anna and Anna and Summer are both being seemingly a quasi couple, and they're kind of just walking off from Seth. And so Seth has to apologize to both of them simultaneously and tell them both it's like, well, hey, like anybody would have wanted to choose either one of you, and I'm sorry that I couldn't have chose between either of you. So we ultimately have that to where that breaks up seemingly Anna and Summer to where ultimately they're eventually going to want to try to get to uh, Summer. So, or they're ultimately going to get to Seth, I mean. So, like, funny enough, when eventually Seth gets into hot water with both of these gals, ultimately we have Seth faking that he's sick to his dad to ultimately get out of school. And I thought it was hilarious how Ryan was just like, "Oh yeah, like do you have the summer flu?" and and Seth is like, "Well, it's November, so no." And we have it to where Ryan is like, "Well, maybe you need some antibiotics." So like in like the whole episode where ultimately Ryan ultimately gives everybody a look, and then reasonably like Seth is like, how do you do that with just a look? You can just like tell that ultimately you're just kind of like, nah, you're ticked off about something. And plus they also had that one early morning thing where ultimately Kirsten has to go to do yoga lattes, and so ultimately Sandy is just so happy about saying yoga lattes consistently, like yoga lattes. I hope you're going to enjoy your yoga lattes. To where ultimately Kirsten's like, you just love saying that word. And he's like, yoga lattes, yoga lattes. To where ultimately they like kept like pinging it in there even more. So we ultimately have it to where at some point that Ryan and Sandy are actually in the clear for getting in trouble. And so ultimately we have to where Sandy and Ryan are like clinking their mugs in success. That ultimately they are not in hot water for freaking once. And ultimately Seth is in hot water and Kirsten's in hot water. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably uh, Seth is to ultimately pick between the two, and ultimately New Year's is coming up, and so reasonably we have it to where it seems like one of the gals are ultimately going to end up with Seth, but we'll get there. So Marissa ultimately going to a downward spiral, ultimately shoplifting with Ryan, because ultimately we find a security guard that ultimately is probably loss prevention, and ultimately going to arrest Marissa for trying to steal things. So we have it to where Jimmy is ultimately telling Marissa, it's like, you know what, you really need to see therapy. It's like, if anything, you're kind of very, like, you're very destructive, and like, you just need to go to therapy. So we have it to her reasonably. They end up booking therapy for Marissa, and we end up seeing a guy of sorts that is there that I ultimately do not know the name of. But it seems like this guy is just like, he's a really good manipulator. He's a really good, uh, like, he's talking to Marissa, and like, she is just falling under this guy's spell. Recently, it seemed like this guy had mentioned that he's talked about painkillers and this and that, all the stuff that he could quite possibly take and stuff like that. And we have it to where this guy is otherwise approaching Marissa, and really just trying to ask what her damage is, like, ask what her backstory is, uh, because he wants to put up this persona that he's good for her, which he actually isn't. He's actually the worst possible thing for her, because reasonably, he's going to put off this persona that reasonably he's going to put off this persona that, hey, like, maybe you should end up with me because I'm good for you, kind of thing. And like, I'm going to make you think that I'm going to, like, brain ninja you into my life, kind of thing. Because we have this guy that otherwise is reasonably, I don't know what it is. It feels like Marissa is just hypnotized by this guy. It's weird. I'm trying to find where this guy's name is right now. In this cast of sorts. Uh, but anyways, so we go on to here, and ultimately, that's not it. So we go on to here, and so, come on, where is it? Where's the name? Where's the name of this character? So what happens when you have to scroll down a million characters to find one character? Uh, Come on. Well, anyways, so we go on to here, and again, Marissa is hypnotized by this guy, and reasonably, it just feels like he has this sorrow story that ultimately he is to. Man, I cannot find this name. Forget it. So we ultimately go into having this guy ultimately like, hey, Marissa, you want to go to this party at this four-seasoned hotel that I have? Wouldn't it be great for you to come with me to this four-seasoned hotel thing? Like, ultimately, it's la-di-da and whatever. So we happen to have it to where ultimately Marissa goes to this party, and we have it to Ryan is kind of scrambling to make it to Marissa by midnight. So we have it to her reasonably that Marissa is ending up with this guy who ultimately is saying this story about a girl that ultimately is going to be at this party. But we have it to her when Marissa goes to this party that coincidentally that this girlfriend of this guy doesn't show up. He's like, oh yeah, like, you know what? I was expecting for her to show up, but she's not. So we have it to a reasonably. Marissa is ultimately like whining and complaining about like, well, like, I don't think Ryan's gonna show up when I need him to, and ultimately that's when this guy is like, well, yeah, like, my girl like didn't didn't show up either. I'm like, yeah, because she's imaginary. It's a person that he made. It's a person that he made up. Like this guy is like a lot of talk. He talks a lot of, and he has to back it all up, and he can't. But he's just this master manipulator. That Marissa is just like, I'm hypnotized. So we have it to a reasonably that Ryan is making his way to Marissa to kiss her before the ball drops. It seems that ultimately, while that's going on, we eventually have Sandy and Kirsten, who are kind of going through a rut of things, and because ultimately we have Haley popping in to ultimately tell Kirsten, it's like, dude, you're in a rut. Like you guys are finishing one another's sentences. Like you guys like know each other in and out, and it's just kind of boring. Like, isn't it boring? So we end up having Sandy and Kirsten going into a swingers get together. Where ultimately they're like, oh my god, this is a swingers get together, and so reasonably we have it to where Sandy ends up dropping his watch into some bowl, and so everybody's picking up their watches, and we find out that that Sandy is realizing that he had kept his watch with him at all times, because Kirsten wasn't going to go in there and go and grab a watch, and so recently we have a tour. Kirsten and Sandy both end up together, walking out of this party and going home. So Haley is ultimately Kirsten's sister, and she ultimately is consistently appearing seemingly in a t-shirt and panties, and that's all she's wearing. To where the point is of where ultimately Seth ends up giving his robe to her. So we ultimately have it to where Ryan ultimately meets Haley, and evidently the pool house was Haley's home away from home. And we ultimately have it to where we have Ryan meeting Haley, and Haley's like, "Who are you?" And he's ultimately like, "Well, it's a long story." So eventually we have Haley while Kirsten and Sandy are gone. We have it to where Haley puts on a party, and this party eventually gets too out of hand because Haley owes some money to some people, and so reasonably we have it to where Ryan has to scare people off. So, but then after he scares people off, he has to rush to go and kiss Kirsten before the ball drops. We ultimately have it to where Anna is seeking out Seth to ultimately just not be alone during New Year's. We have it to where Summer is at this 4-star hotel kissing a man that isn't Seth Cohen, and so ultimately she walks away in utter just misbelief of the fact that like she cannot be with anybody else but Seth, and I thought that that was such a fascinating thing. So you ultimately have it to where seemingly everything is quasi seemingly going to work out in the end, but I can pretend that it's not going to for everybody, let's just say. So, what happened there? So, reasonably, we have it to where Caleb is also doing something very underhanding where he's trying to do some research to see how viable his land is, that ultimately he's going to try to get as much money out of the out of that land that he has from these people that are going to try to save this place that ultimately Caleb had sent. And so recently Caleb did this test and found out that there's no way that they could build any of housing of golf courses of nothing there. And so reasonably Caleb can't make any money off of this place, but he's ultimately making as much money as he can off of this place, even though he can't build anything off of it. So we have it to where ultimately Kirsten is seeing this report and is going to hand it to Sandy, and we have it to where ultimately Sandy is going to tell Caleb that's like, hey, we realize that this thing has no value to you anymore. So, hey, how about you just sell it back to us for one whole dollar? So Caleb ends up doing that, and because reasonably we have Caleb where he thinks at first he outsmarts Sandy, but then Sandy outsmarts him. It's like, ha ha ha, suck it. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably I think that's pretty much all that I probably wanted to focus on through these episodes. Considering there were 6 episodes and there was a lot of things going on, recently I think the most miserable points were probably like Marissa's story because I just a lot of the stuff she ends up doing or a lot of the stuff that they have her do is just kind of I don't really care for any of that stuff. So other than that, just kind of recounting and thinking of any little thing of anything that I missed. There was a lot. Again, there's a lot of good jokes, pretty solid stuff, interesting things. But at the end of the day, I think that's all I can say about these episodes. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.